The sky over Rabaul was heavy with heat and the haze of burning fuel. In the operations tent at Tobera Airfield, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai's laughter rang out like a challenge. His squadron officers gathered around, waiting for him to read aloud the latest intelligence dispatch. The paper in his hand crinkled with moisture, ink smudged from fingers slick with sweat and engine oil. He cleared his throat. "They call it the Hellcat." The laughter rippled through the tent. The Americans, the men who had struggled so clumsily to build a fighter worthy of the skies, now claimed to have produced something to rival the Zero. Sakai, one of the most decorated aces in Japan's Naval Air Service, folded the report and tossed it onto the table. Too heavy to turn, too slow to climb, another American metal box. They believed it. All of them did. For nearly 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had flown circles around Allied aircraft. From Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, from Darwin to the Aleutians, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had ruled with grace and lethality. Light, agile, devastating in close combat, its pilots called it the Sword of the Emperor. The Americans, by contrast, had clung to clunky machines that could not match the Zero's turn radius or fuel endurance. The Grumman Wildcat, the P-40 Warhawk, even the sleek British Spitfire, none had lasted long in the crucible of Pacific dogfights, and so they dismissed the new arrival. The F6F Hellcat, they said, was an engineer's fantasy, a mistake. It looked wrong, too thick, too armored, too American. Its wings were too wide, its body too bulky. It was the kind of fighter, one officer joked, that needed an aircraft carrier just to carry its own weight. They had no way of knowing that within weeks, this mistake would begin the methodical destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The first sightings came from Marcus Island. A patrol spotted a formation of blue-painted aircraft, single engine, radial nose, wide wings, climbing through broken clouds. Petty Officer Fukui, who had flown against B-17 and B-25s, thought at first they were bombers, but when they turned to engage, something was off. These planes moved differently. They didn't dive and run. They went up, straight up, using the kind of vertical climb the Zero had always owned. And then the gunfire started. The Hellcat didn't just fire, it spat walls of metal. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, firing more than 4,000 rounds per minute, lit the sky. Fukui's wingman vanished in a blossom of flame. Fukui's own aircraft bucked under the impact of 17 hits in under 5 seconds. His canopy cracked. Oil sprayed across his goggles. He barely made it home. It was not a fluke. Within days, more sightings confirmed the pattern. These new American fighters refused to engage in turning fights. Instead, they attacked from above, from beyond sight, slashing in with terrifying speed before climbing away, leaving Japanese pilots spinning in the empty air. Their armor allowed them to absorb hits. Their engines, massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasps, let them outclimb and outdive anything in the Japanese inventory. And most dangerously of all, they fought in pairs. Atop briefing tables in Tokyo, analysts spread out diagrams and chalk lines showing engagements where Hellcats worked in harmony, one aircraft drawing attention, the other sweeping in from behind. Japanese doctrine had emphasized the lone warrior, the art of the individual kill. But the Americans, with their radios and their formations, were creating something else entirely: aerial combat as a machine. In Wake Island, the Zeros had altitude, position, surprise. But the Hellcats didn't break. They absorbed the first passes, climbed to altitude, and came down like thunder. 8 Zeros were lost in that engagement. Not a single Hellcat failed to return. By the time reports filtered back to Rabaul, the mood in the operations tents had changed. There were fewer jokes. The laughter was gone. One pilot wrote home, "It is not just a new plane. It is a new way of flying. They do not fight us, they hunt us. Over Formosa, the cost became undeniable. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched to intercept American carrier raids. The return rate was catastrophic. Over 300 planes lost. Pilots with names known throughout the fleet, gone. The Hellcats, with their superior climb, radar guidance, and devastating firepower, had turned the Pacific skies into kill boxes. By the end of 1944, even the most decorated aces of the Empire knew the war had changed. Not because of one dogfight, not because of one plane, but because of a system. The Americans had built a fighter that didn't just protect the pilot, it enabled him. The Hellcat didn't need to outturn the Zero. It simply didn't have to play by the Zero's rules. The skies over the Pacific no longer whispered myths. They roared with industrial truth. It was now October 1943, and the waters around Wake Island shimmered beneath the midday sun. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 14, flight decks buzzed with activity. American sailors checked fuel lines, loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds, and wiped sweat from their brows. Below deck, pilots of VF-5 studied charts and briefings. They were not legends, not yet. But they were about to step into a war that would make them so. Lieutenant Tom Ritchie, just 22 years old and barely a year removed from farm fields in Iowa, climbed into his F6F Hellcat. He ran through his pre-flight checks with a calm drilled into him by months of training. His instructors had not spoken of glory. They had spoken of velocity, torque, bullet drop, and fuel efficiency. The Hellcat he sat in was not built to win through flair. It was built to win through force. Above him, the Zero still ruled the Japanese imagination. Sleek and nimble, it had danced circles around Allied fighters from Pearl Harbor to Java. But this time, the enemy would find that the air was no longer theirs. As the Hellcats took off, Ritchie could see his wingmen forming up around him. They didn't look fast. They didn't look elegant. But they looked ready. The blue-gray fighters, shaped like barrels with wings, had a presence. Each was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that delivered brute strength rather than finesse. Each carried 6 Browning M2 machine guns, enough firepower to shred anything in their path. At 15,000 feet, radar controllers aboard USS Lexington vectored the fighters toward incoming bogies. The technology guiding them, shipboard radar and coordinated fighter direction, was something Japanese flyers had no equivalent for. The sky was now gridded and controlled, not guessed. Ritchie heard the call. Bandits 250, Angels 15. He turned his formation. 10 miles out, the Zeros came into view, sleek silhouettes banking into the sun. It was supposed to be their advantage. But the Hellcats didn't flinch. The Japanese pilots dove, expecting the slow American machines to scatter. Instead, the Hellcats maintained formation. They accelerated downward, not to flee, but to engage. In those seconds before contact, something subtle shifted. The Zero pilots had always believed their superiority was natural, ordained by training and tradition. But the F6Fs below were not machines of sentiment. They were machines of war. Ritchie's guns spoke first. He fired a 1-second burst at a Zero crossing his nose. The tracers met their target mid-roll, wings sheared, smoke burst, and the Japanese fighter cartwheeled into the ocean. He didn't cheer. He didn't speak. He just rejoined formation and found another target. By the time the Americans returned to their carriers, 8 Zeros had been downed. No Hellcats were lost. That ratio would become common. It wasn't luck, it was systems. Radios allowed American pilots to call threats. Armor let them take hits. Self-sealing tanks gave them a chance to survive. And above all, tactics gave them the space to think, adapt, and kill. Further engagements reinforced the lesson. Hellcat squadrons flew in pairs, practiced energy fighting, and refused to dogfight on the enemy's terms. They dove in, fired with deadly precision, and climbed out. It was aerial warfare as strategy, not art. Each battle was a grid, each pilot a component. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. They were a system designed to erase the enemy. Japanese commanders struggled to adapt. On Formosa, they committed hundreds of aircraft in hopes of scoring a decisive blow. Their reports claimed dozens of American ships sunk. In reality, the Americans lost 89 aircraft total. Japan lost over 300, and with them, their last reserve of experienced pilots. The young men taking their place had 60 flight hours, often less. Some had never fired live rounds before facing Hellcats. The veterans who watched them go up, never to return, knew the war was already lost. By early 1944, Japanese naval aviation was bleeding to death in the skies, and everywhere the killing happened, the F6F Hellcat was there, relentless, unsentimental, unbreakable. The turning point did not arrive with pomp or a heroic last stand. It appeared quietly in the thick Pacific haze on June 19, 1944, above the sea lanes off Saipan. It emerged not as a clash of wills, but a collision of systems. The Japanese carrier force, still numbered, still confident, launched wave after wave of Zeros, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes. Their pilots believed they fought in a tradition older than steel, a code of honor, maneuver, and individual excellence. But the enemy they met wore blue-gray paint and a gun belt wide as aspiration. F6F Hellcat squadrons climbed to 20,000 feet, their escorts linked by radio, their wings choreographed. Radar teams aboard U.S. carriers vectored them. Controllers in cramped deck cages watched blips move and whispered headings. When the Japanese formations crept into range, the Hellcats descended upon them like stormhawks. The first wave of Zeros bolted for engagement, but the Hellcats refused to enter a turning match. Instead, they dove, fired, and climbed. One pass, that was all. In the span of seconds, a veteran Japanese pilot found his machine lurching into a downward spiral, tracer streams cascading away. He never felt the kill coming. The gun slugs found him before he saw his enemy. In the sky, the sword was no longer enough. After mission debriefs confirmed the pattern, of the 346 Japanese planes lost that day, 27 of them were Zeros. American counts recorded 30 Allied aircraft lost. The reports filtered back to Tokyo as numbers without context, and that was the problem. The Japanese press listed the loss as unfortunate but acceptable. Their naval staff quietly replayed the engagements, but their doctrine remained unchanged. They still believed the fighter pilot's body-mind was the weapon. They still believed a nimble fighter could dance around the heavy American. They still laughed. At a training airfield on Formosa, instructors gathered at dawn. Among them was Saburo Sakai, scarred, aware, but still part of the machine. He watched the roster of young pilots, barely trained, under-equipped, deficient in experience, and he worried. Many had never flown before 0500 hours. Many had never fired live ammo outside mock ranges. Meanwhile, the Hellcat pilots, fresh from Texas training, vaulted into the air with 300 hours minimum, formation trained, carrier tested. The gulf was widening. In those months, the technical gap grew too stark to ignore. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 delivers about 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, and even more with water injection. It would climb at 3,500 feet per minute and reach 25,000 feet before the Zero's engine began to fail. The Zero's light frame and long-winged advantage vanished in thin air. Its controls stiffened, its speed bled off. Hellcats, meanwhile, accelerated downslope, used the dive, climbed back, and repeated. The Japanese manuals did not contain a chapter for this kind of fight. Even harder was the psychological toll. Survivors of the A6M0 squadrons later described Hellcat psychosis, a state where a pilot, sensing altitude loss and enemy above, refused to engage. The air no longer felt safe. The trees drifted beneath wings, but the enemy came from the sky. At sea, Japanese carrier strike shooters found themselves targeted before they launched. Controllers guided Hellcats to intercept points with mathematical clarity. The enemy had become invisible, inevitable, unstoppable. And as the summer of 1944 spilled into autumn, the signs of collapse were all around. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Zeros flew into former airfields and never returned. Their pilots touched down in damaged aircraft and commented simply, "We have lost the sky." Mechanized carriers launched Hellcats from dawn to dusk. The mountains of Okinawa, the jungles of Philippines, the decks of battleships, they all became fields of destruction where the heavy Hellcat reigned. In the wrecked hangars on Japanese islands, engineers stripped down captured Hellcats. They counted 2,840 precision-machined parts in the R2800 engine alone, each interchangeable. Compare it to the Nakajima Sakai engine of the Zero, a complex fit machine, each part hand-matched. Japan's industrial system could not replicate the American logistics, scale, or maintenance. The aircraft was only the tip of the spear. The system behind it was the point. By the end of 1944, less than 100 combat-experienced Japanese naval pilots remained. The line between victory and defeat had slipped from the cockpit to the factory floor, from the air to the logistics chain. The Hellcat had not just won battles, it had won the war in the air. December 1944. The Pacific skies no longer echoed with confident challenge. They trembled under an entirely new calculus of dominance. In the jungled atolls, on the decks of carriers steaming west, and across the burning airfields of the Philippines and Okinawa, the F6F Hellcat squadrons of the United States Navy pressed their advantage and broke what had once seemed unbreakable. The Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter arm, built on the prestige of the Mitsubishi A6M0, its pilots steeped in the samurai myth of aerial combat, was now visibly unraveling. The process did not begin with heroic final charges. It began in the boreal dawns above the Central Pacific and matured in the heat of December's campaigns. The date marked more than just calendar turning. It marked the collapse of assumptions. Japanese fighter pilots were no longer the masters of the air. They were the hunted. Columns of Zeros that once flew with swagger now hesitated. Their pilots questioned what they saw overhead. Heavy gray-blue aircraft climbing above the clouds, gliding into position with mathematical precision, not desperation. In the skies above the Marianas, where the great carrier battles unfolded, Hellcats stacked 20,000 feet above the horizon, while Japanese formations still searched for dawn's first glimpse. Radar nets aboard U.S. carriers vectored the Hellcat divisions into intercepts. Japanese intelligence had once mocked the radios and toggled channels of American fighters. Now they realized those radios, that coordination, gave Hellcats the altitude, the initiative, the first strike. The Zero's agility, its turn-and-burn method, simply did not matter in a war where the enemy attacked downward, fired once, and climbed back to safety. At one intercept, Japanese reports described 8 Zeros diving on an American carrier strike group. They expected chaos, but found calm. Hellcats bored into their formation from above. The tracers erupted. The Japanese fighters spun away. Alarms on their decks' locator radios screamed confusion rather than direction. Within minutes, 8 Zeros lay smoking in the sea. No Hellcat was lost. What had once been dogfight transformed into slashing precision. On land bases, the picture was no less bleak for Japan. The pilot training program, once exemplary, strained under shortages. The Japanese Naval Air Arm entered the war with pilots who logged 700 hours before combat. By late 1944, new pilots were arriving with fewer than 200 hours, sometimes only 100. Their adversaries in Hellcat squadrons came with 300-plus hours of training, carrier landing experience, gunnery hours, tactical drills in energy fighting, and weapons they trusted. The Zero brought intimacy, finesse, daring. The Hellcat brought teamwork, technology, logistics. Technical specifications revealed the disparity plainly. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine delivered roughly 2,000 horsepower and with water injection even higher, which allowed climbs of 3,000 feet per minute or more and true performance at altitude. In contrast, the Zero's engine, optimized for low altitude, lost power as it climbed, and its turn radius advantage dwindled as speeds rose. In test reports captured after the war, Japanese engineers found the Hellcat could reach altitudes and maintain energy their own machines could not. The turning fight, the Zero's doctrinal comfort zone, was obsolete. Armor and protection further widened the margin. The Hellcat carried bulletproof windshields, self-sealing fuel tanks, and pilot armor fairings. Japanese Zeros sacrificed armor and redundancy in favor of lightweight and maneuverability. In mixed engagements, the Hellcats absorbed hits that crippled Zeros. The Japanese pilot who managed to survive his first few minutes with the Hellcat in front described seeing tracer streams, hearing bursts above, then spinning out. The sky no longer shielded, it betrayed. Meanwhile, Japanese formations fought outdated tactics. The concept of the lone samurai pilot, of individual mastery and turning combat, had defined the Zero's early victories. But by December 1944, the Hellcat pilots flew as formulas. Twin plane pairs, high plane and low plane, each covering the other's blind spots. They communicated. They escalated. They returned home. Japanese pilots expected to fight individually, made sacrifice and heroism central to their doctrine. They found themselves outnumbered, outcoordinated, outmatched by machines rather than fighters. The consequence of this shift became painfully visible. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese pilots launched wave after wave of aircraft only to fall into Hellcat traps above them. More than 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The U.S. Navy lost fewer than 20. The numbers alone told the tale. This was no equal fight. The losses were catastrophic, not only for machines or men, but for morale, doctrine, belief. Japanese command parlance later coined Hellcat psychosis to describe pilots whose first encounter with Hellcats ended their will to fight. As the Ardennes had been for the ground war in Europe, so too was Okinawa for the air war in the Pacific. With American carriers pushing ever closer, Hellcats patrolled the skies, struck kamikaze launches, protected fleet formations, and interdicting Japanese airfields. The Japanese Air Arm resorted increasingly to desperation tactics. The kamikaze program, aimed at reversing the imbalance, was not a sign of strategy. It was a sign of surrender. That the Hellcat's impact extended even into denying suicide attacks marks its broader force, not just supremacy, but prevention. On one April morning, Hellcats swept through Japanese escort carriers. Arriving above at 25,000 feet, they dove into the decks. Strafe ran with 8 0.50 caliber guns, climbed back above, and headed home. Japanese pilots scrambled in pairs, too late. Their fuel shortage, inability to maintain formation, limited experience meant they could not respond. They flew like ghosts, setting off bombs, and then being shot down. The sky had become a vault of inevitability. Production and logistics sealed the victory. The United States built over 12,000 Hellcats in just over 2 years. The Japanese, beset by resource constraints, built fewer modern fighters, retrained pilots with fewer hours, replaced losses with minimal training. The system that had produced the Zero's air arm was suffering collapse. Within Japanese fighter pilot circles, survivors described watching their wingmen vanish, then refusing to fight. They did not simply fear the enemy, they feared the sky. The irony was brutal. The air could no longer be assumed friendly. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviation had fewer than 100 experienced pilots left in theater. The soaring of the Zero, once symbol of Japanese aerial ascendancy, had become a memory. The arrival of the Hellcat was more than an aircraft introduction. It was a declaration of transformation. Carriers once vulnerable became fortresses. American fleets could linger near Japanese home waters under Hellcat umbrellas of control. Tactics once believed timeless were now antiques. In the dense jungles beneath swirling contrails and above eruptions of tracer fire, the last Japanese fighter units flew missions that had already been lost. Their leaders, once masters of aviation, now counted losses, not victories. Their pilots trained less, fueled less, flew less, and died more. Each turn of the Zero that once signified mastery now signified desperation. When the guns finally fell silent and the carriers returned to port, the wreckage was not confined to the Pacific Islands. It was in the flight decks, the pilot rosters, the training manuals. The narrative of the fighter ace, the solitary warrior turned legend, was replaced by networks, by systems, by tactics that scaled, synchronized, and overwhelmed. For the Japanese air arm, the lesson came too late. The Hellcat didn't simply win because it was better, it won because the world it fought in had changed. It was no longer a duel of wills. It was a war of systems, and the one who built the better system won. And so as the stardust of war settled, the Hellcat stood not only as a victor, but as a symbol of how the skies of the Pacific were rewritten. What the Japanese pilots had mocked as weight and bulk, the Americans had turned into dominance. The Zero had been the sword, the Hellcat the strategy. The fool laughed at it, and then discovered the laughter belonged to the victor. The final act unfolded where the Pacific met fire and desperation, Okinawa, the Philippines, the carriers steaming beneath endless blue. By this moment, the Grumman F6F Hellcat had eclipsed mere dominance. It had become the axis on which the aerial war turned. Japanese naval aviation, once proud, once invincible, was in free fall. The Zeros, the Bushido-trained aces, the revered fighter pilots, they all knew it before their machines did. In April 1945, during Battle of Okinawa, the skies filled with kamikaze raids. 1,900 sorties launched against the fleet. Pilots trained for one thing: collision. The Hellcats weren't just there to fight, they were there to stop death from falling into the sea. A division led by Eugene Valencia, veteran Hellcat pilot, executed tactics so systematically lethal that the Japanese came to fear their own sky. Valencia's mowing machine, 4 Hellcats in line, separated by 100 yards, sweeping through formations at high speed, became legend. One pass, climb, repeat. Japanese formations couldn't adapt. They fell piece by piece. Kill ratios soared. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties, claimed approximately 2,351 victories against 249 losses, a ratio of about 9.5 to 1 in that campaign alone. More significantly, they prevented roughly 80% of kamikaze aircraft from reaching their targets. The Japanese Navy, strapped for pilots, fuel, and parts, watched as their last hope turned into hostages of the sky. Behind the scenes, the tech chasm yawned. The Hellcat, in its F6F-5 variant, carried water injection boosts, rockets, improved armor, and the K-14 computing gun sight that automatically calculated deflection. Japanese engineers dissected captured Hellcats after the war and found the truth stark. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine alone contained over 2,840 precision-machined parts, each interchangeable. The Mitsubishi A6M0's Nakajima Sakai engine required hand-fitting. Japan had flown the Zero into legend. America had built the Hellcat into infrastructure. And as the Japanese pilot corps collapsed into improvisation, 40 to 50 hours training for new Navy pilots, no flight time for kamikaze pilots, they lost more than planes. They lost identity. The culture that bred warrior pilots trusted machines' grace over systems. The Hellcat proved otherwise. Each pilot in the American war machine was connected, trained, equipped, tactically backed, coordinated. The Japanese warrior now flew alone into a networked future. From the decks of carriers to the hangars of Japanese island bases, the wreckage told stories. One Japanese ace, Saburo Sakai, still wounded from early encounters, reflected late in life. "We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future." The ruin of his air arm wasn't simply loss of machines, it was loss of relevance. In the last carrier-to-carrier battles, such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the pattern only deepened. Japanese fleets launched their best. The Americans launched Hellcats stacked at altitude, vectored by radar, coordinated by voice, supported by armor and numbers. The Zero's turn-circle advantage vanished. The lesson: the fighter that could won only because the system behind it could wild. Production figures enshrined the shift. More than 12,000 Hellcats were produced in just 30 months. In 1944 alone, the United States built 35,000 fighters. Japan, constrained by resources and bombing, produced about 5,100. The logistical dominance matured into strategic dominance. The Hellcat didn't just win fights, it turned carriers into fortresses, fleets into steel umbrellas, campaigns into conveyor belts. Admiral Mark Mitcher summed it: "With the Hellcat, we don't need to find them first. Let them come." And so, from the jungles of the Philippines to the decks of carriers steaming near Japan, the final outcome was set. The Japanese Navy's elite pilot corps, once invincible, shrunk from thousands to fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots by August 1945. The Zeros remained in hangars or as kamikaze vehicles, not fighters. The culture of aerial mastery gave way to mechanics of destruction. The skies that once echoed Banzai now resonated with the hum of twin .50 machine guns and the roar of R2800s. The story was not simply about one plane, it was about one philosophy. The Zero embodied the individual warrior, agile, light, fast, but singular. The Hellcat embodied the system, robust, deadly, networked, mass-produced. Japanese pilots had mocked it as heavy, clumsy, the American failure of design. They laughed. Then the laughter ceased when they watched the sky fall and heard the kill counts rise. In the final analysis, the numbers themselves speak. The Hellcat destroyed an estimated 5,223 enemy aircraft, while losing only about 270 in air-to-air combat, an overall kill ratio of about 19-1. Japanese pilots faced a reality greater than themselves. The war had evolved. The sword no longer mattered when the machine fired first, climbed high, outran, outgunned, and worked in teams. The victory belonged not to the fastest dogfighter, but to the system that deployed weapon, pilot, tactics, logistic, every hour of every day. And when the surrender broadcast echoed across Japan on August 15, 1945, the final act of the war in the Pacific closed. Black-painted Hellcats from USS Yorktown landed at Atsugi Airfield. Japanese pilots and ground crew stood in rows, staring, some unspeaking. One American Hellcat pilot looped over the runway, then rolled level. "You have to understand," he told them through an interpreter. "This isn't even pushing it. In combat with water injection, it is 20% more powerful. I've never managed to break one." The Japanese guard never laughed. For the men inside the cockpits, for the mechanics back home, for the women on the production lines, the Hellcat's legacy stood firm. The aerial war of the Pacific proved a truth. In modern combat, equipment matters, but the system matters more. The nation that could build the better system defeated the one that built better warriors. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the Hellcat, but it had the last laugh. It always did. In the brief span of weeks and months, that laughter had turned to awe, fear, and then silence. By the time the final zero was torn from the sky, every Japanese pilot who had survived knew it. The war was over long before the flag was lowered. It ended in the cockpits, in the clouds, in the moments when their skill met something they could not fight, a future they weren't trained to face. But this is not just a story of dogfights and kill ratios. It is, at its heart, a story about people, about the young men who strapped themselves into machines they barely understood, about the engineers who worked through the night to give them just a fraction more power, about the families who said goodbye and prayed their sons would return from skies filled with flame and fury. To the American pilots who flew the Hellcat, who launched from wooden decks into the unknown, know this: you carried more than wings and armor. You carried the hopes of a nation, the grit of workers, the belief that precision could overcome desperation. You didn't just fly, you defined an era. You protected convoys, repelled attacks, and created the conditions for victory, not just in battle, but in belief. To the families who waited, watched telegrams arrive, and feared every knock on the door, you were part of the fight too. Your sacrifices shaped the air war. Your patience and resilience, unheralded though they may be, mattered. Every plane that took off carried with it the prayers and pride of those back home. To the Japanese pilots, those who fought valiantly, who followed their orders, who died believing in a cause, we acknowledge your courage. History has judged the war, but not your humanity. Many of you flew outdated machines into hopeless odds and still pressed on. Some fought until the very end. Others surrendered with honor. Your loss was not only strategic, it was spiritual. The way of the warrior met the force of the machine, and it broke hearts as well as wings. And for the veterans still with us, those who remember the sound of radial engines, the scream of a dive, the hum of a carrier deck, we honor you. Your stories are carved into history. Your victories are our inheritance. You fought not just with steel and fire, but with intellect, endurance, and loyalty. You did not merely survive. You changed the course of civilization. Let this video, this recounting, be more than nostalgia. Let it be a reminder of what war costs, of what innovation can do, of how nations can rise, not just through warriors, but through welders, machinists, designers, and dreamers. The F6F Hellcat was not beautiful. It did not dance like a Zero. It did not sweep into legend like a Mustang. It simply did what needed to be done, again and again, without fail. It was the hammer of the Pacific, the protector, the avenger, the lifeline. And in that, it became more than metal. It became memory. So, to all who served, in the sky, on the ground, behind the lines, we say thank you. Your courage made history. Your legacy is why we remember. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment for the veterans in your family, for the stories passed down, for the freedom built by those who flew under fire. Every interaction helps this legacy reach new eyes, new hearts, new generations. Because as long as we remember, they are never truly gone. The Hellcat had the last laugh, not in triumph, but in testimony, and we carry that story forward with honor.